This happened maybe around 6 years ago, but I still constantly thinking about it. Me, 11, and my two friends, I'll call them E, 11, and S, 13. We were planning on spending the night in a tent in my backyard. I live in the middle of nowhere on 4 acres of land that has a 2-acre big opening surrounded by rows of trees. We set up a campfire night in the middle of the open and sat around it for a couple hours, just hanging out and talking. My dog Chester, all of a sudden, growled and barked a couple times, but to be honest, I didn't think much of it since I felt safe on my yard, and he always barked at random things. We got tired and decided to hop into the tent and watch a movie before going to sleep. By the time the movie ended, it was around 2 a.m., and we all decided it was time to go to bed. My dog started barking, and yet again, I just ignored it. Looking back, the amount of times he barked wasn't normal. S was already asleep. I was starting to drift off, and E was still awake, when someone outside tripped over the tent rope line and fell onto my head. Since I was in the corner of the tent, I was so tired and half asleep, so somehow it didn't startle me or even register in my brain properly. I just thought maybe it was my dad checking up on us to make sure we were okay. I got up, walked slowly to the front of the tent, and unzipped it. Something inside of me told me to pretend to be asleep and not to look. The door stayed unzipped for about a minute or two before it got zipped back up, and the person walked away. My friend E woke me up terrified, asking who the fuck it was. I told her it was probably just my dad checking up on us and to go back to sleep. She told me it didn't look like him, and I thought she was just being paranoid because we just watched a horror movie. I really wish I would have listened, but I just wasn't scared. In the morning, we all went inside to eat breakfast with my family, so naturally, I bring up my dad tripping over the tent rope last night and hitting my head just to tease him because I found it funny. He looked at me confused and said he never went outside to check up on us. I got a little scared, but I thought maybe it was just my older brother messing with us, but turns out he was at a friend's house that night. So I asked my friend exactly what she saw. She said she was also pretending to be asleep, but she peeked at the door for a moment and saw something with a long beard and big ears staring in at us. The weirdest thing is that we never heard a vehicle or anything come by, so how did this person get all the way to my house? We still have no idea who or what it was, and it freaks me out. I truly believe it wasn't my dad because he would never scare us like that, and if he did, he would have told it to us right then and there. I don't know why the thing only stared at us and did nothing else, but I'm so thankful nothing terrible happened to us. Who knows, maybe if we didn't pretend to sleep, it could have gone very wrong. We were 3 young girls sleeping alone in a tent after all. Safe to say, no more backyard sleepovers for me. And after that, I learned that I have no survival instincts. This is a story my dad told me many times, and I thought I'd share it with y'all here. Back in 1966, when my dad was little, around 13 or 14, he had begun reading what I like to call no-no books. Black magic type evil books. One night, around 2 to 3 in the morning, my dad got up to use the restroom. When he came out of the restroom, he heard what sounded like whispers coming from his room. At first, he thought it may have been my grandparents talking in their room, but as he sat and listened, he noticed it was coming from the opposite side of the room, from where his parents' room would have been. My dad finally pinpointed where it was coming from, the upper corner of the walls and ceiling mat. My dad told me he did not recognize the language the voices were speaking. He said it sounded like a dead language, one not spoken for 1,000 years. The voices also came through with a heavy hint of static, like an old radio station that's hardly in range. Freaked out, he called for my grandfather to come in there. My grandfather opened his door and froze. "Who's in there with you?" My grandfather asked. "I don't know," my dad said, pointing to the corner of the room. At this point, the whispers have evolved into normal speaking volume. My grandfather walked in and listened for a moment. "What have you been doing in here?" he asked my dad. Without speaking, my dad pointed to a book beside his bed. My grandfather, who was a pastor at the church, his face grew very pale. My grandfather grabbed the book with one hand and his cross he wore around his neck in the other. My dad and my grandfather walked into the living room. My grandfather built a little fire in their fireplace. At this point, my grandmother had come out in her robe and asked, "What's going on?" "Don, who is my dad, I told you no TV this late." My grandfather looked at his wife in horror and said, "Honey, that's not the TV." Once the logs in the fireplace began to burn, my grandfather tossed the book inside and waited. Once the book began to catch fire, the voices turned into screams that rattled the windows. They lasted about 7 seconds before everything went silent. I asked my grandfather about this story, but he would always cut me off and snap, saying, "We do not talk about that night. Period." My grandmother said pretty much the same thing, only nicer in her granny way. My dad had told me this story a dozen times, and it always captivated me. What were those voices? What were they saying? Was my dad close to opening up a portal of some kind? I don't know, but I do know he never picked up a no-no book ever again. I'll preface this by saying I've never been a big believer in the paranormal, but this experience definitely challenged my skepticism. Between 2016 to 2018, I was a supervisor in a warehouse. Over that period of time, but more towards the end of my time there, 3 separate things happened that I found extremely terrifying. The reason being, all 3 were corroborated by other staff members or contractors with no knowledge of the events happening to me too. It's also important to know my company had 2 units, one at either end of the building, and there was another company who owned the larger middle unit. The first thing that happened was seemingly insignificant, but turned out to be creepy. While walking down the aisles, picking up orders, I'd sometimes hear whistling, the sort of whistle you'd make when you were hiding from someone and you wanted to taunt them. The first couple of times it happened, I'd look for a source, a smile on my face, thinking it was one of my colleagues playing with me. There weren't many places one could hide, mind you. There were 5 aisles that ran the full length of the warehouse, and they were narrow. Only one aisle dissected the 5 long aisles down the middle, and you could see between shelves and through most of the racking. Even though I could never find the source, and after that I just shrugged it off, as I couldn't be bothering playing along. Weeks later, one of my colleagues who worked in the other unit told me he used to get freaked out down there because he'd always hear whistling when he was on his own. There were only 2 people working in that unit the vast majority of the time, and he said he heard the whistle coming from the inside of the warehouse when the other guy was outside having a cigarette, so it couldn't have been him. He even mimicked the whistle, and it was the exact same one I used to hear. The second thing that was probably more eerie was I once heard my name being called by a bodiless voice. I was working in the packing area. I was the only person in there, and I heard faintly, at first, my name. I thought maybe it was the radio, and it just sounded like someone calling my name. Then I heard it again, this time more clearly. So I walked to the end of the packing area where it opened up to the warehouse. Not a soul. I even went to the little canteen area where one colleague was sat and asked if he was shouting me, which he denied, and it wouldn't have sounded so loud if he was doing it on the other side of the wall. Then I heard it a third time, this time being clear as a bell. I went out into the warehouse shouting, "Hello? Hello? Is someone shouting me?" There was no one there at all. I checked down every aisle. I even walked through to the office to see if one of the office staff had come in looking for me, but they all denied it and said no one had left the office in that time. The thing that was the weirdest about the whole thing was a few days later, a different colleague, who wasn't even there that day, told me when I'd come back up from the other unit that he heard someone else shouting my name while he was alone. Not his name, still my name. The final and most scary thing that happened to me was when I saw a man out of my peripheral vision walking down the aisle next to me, parallel to me. As soon as I'd registered someone there, I looked across through the gaps in the racking, but there was no one there. We see things out of the corner of our eyes all the time, but the thing is, I'd seen him in detail. He was about 60 years old, with gray hair, glasses, and was wearing white overalls. The uniform at our warehouse was a black polo shirt. I have a pretty good imagination, but I don't think I could have conjured up that vivid image in a split second. A few days later, I was down at our second unit, and there were a couple of subcontractors there, putting up some more racking for us. I got talking to one of them, and he said to me that they were nearly done, and he was going to come in on Saturday morning to finish. But only he could make it, and didn't come in on his own, without his colleague. I asked, "Is that a health and safety thing? That you can't be here on your own?" He replied, "No, it's just whenever I'm here on my own, I see a guy in white overalls walking about and it freaks me out." I felt a tingle run down my spine and legs, and he must have saw the look in my eyes, because as soon as he noticed my expression change, he asked me, "You've seen him before, haven't you?" I still don't know what to make of it, but it creeped me out in the end.